Sci-fi, horror, fantasy, absurdism in the extreme. It's all available here in the Tales from the Omni Vault book series. Check the description for Amazon links so you can get your copies and start reading today. Thank you all, and now, on to the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer, and welcome to One Monstrous Moment 770 edition. This marks both the 7th of these events and 7 decades worth of Godzilla. Now that might make it difficult to pick a scene, I'm sure, but as for me, I think I've got just the thing. Today we'll be landing on one of the best entries in the whole series, the Return of Godzilla. Since this is Godzilla's 70th anniversary, some of you might be wondering why I'm focusing on this movie rather than the original. Well, there are a few reasons. First of all, the Return of Godzilla has an anniversary to celebrate as well, turning 40 years old in 2024. That's a significant milestone in its own right. Further, I still feel that this movie deserves more attention and respect than it usually gets. I do understand where that indifference comes from, though. You see, for a very long time, this movie was nearly lost in the West. It was readily available on VHS for a while, but when DVDs came around, disputes about rights kept it from getting released until the late 2010s, specifically during a point where kaiju movies were still considered too niche for the mainstream to take notice. That release from Kraken Entertainment only lasted so long before it too vanished. As of this point, it only just became available on streaming. Heck, even then, only the original version is available. The American cut with Raymond Burr is still tangled up in rights issues and is on the verge of being lost altogether. Say what you want about the rest of it, but Burr gave it his all. This resulted in the movie falling off of people's radar. Even people who champion Godzilla movies with socio-political messages and shun everything else tend to overlook this one just because it's been so hard to find for so long. So the Return of Godzilla has had a rough history outside of Japan, leading to an out-of-sight, out-of-mind scenario. As long as it remained inaccessible, it was like the movie didn't exist at all. Yeah, not even 80s nostalgia has been able to work in its favor. And that's a shame, too, because the movie really is quite brilliant. Make no mistake, it's definitely a product of the time it was made. The Return of Godzilla lives and dies on its connection to the Cold War as it stood in the 80s. In particular, it reflects the fear that someone in either America or Russia was going to push the button and nuke the world, and how the people of Japan in particular felt about it at the time. It runs the full gamut. Some people are proactively trying to avert catastrophe, some are trying to spread wisdom and common sense to the powers that be, and some just figure there's nothing left to do but grab some snacks and enjoy watching the fire before it catches up to them. This makes the movie a window into the past, shedding light on a perspective of the Cold War that rarely gets acknowledged. So how can I pick just one scene from it? Well, it was actually quite easy to do. Okay, so a little bit of setup is necessary because a lot has led up to this point. To start, the Super X appears to have successfully neutralized Godzilla by blasting him with cadmium rockets. The king isn't dead, but he is unconscious, having collapsed limply into a building, and a crowd of people who have not evacuated gathers around him. However, when Godzilla came ashore earlier, he damaged a Russian ship in the harbor that's disguised as a cargo vessel, but which has aborted a computer linked to a satellite that can launch nukes from orbit. The damage started a countdown, and the lone survivor unfortunately failed to stop it before further damage finished him off. The missile thus begins its descent towards Tokyo. For those who remember it differently, the American edit reworked things so the Russian was determined to launch the nuke instead of stopping it. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Fortunately, the Americans launched their own missile to intercept the nuke before it hits, and that brings us up to speed so we can get to the beginning of the scene proper. The American counteroffensive works, setting the Russian nuke off in high orbit above Tokyo. Upon detonation, the sky turns an eerie shade of red that's nearly as bright as day, and a powerful EMP immediately hits the city. Anything electrical in Tokyo shuts down, including the Super X. From that red sky, bolts of what appear to be lightning arc towards the ground, drawn inexorably to the fallen kaiju. This nuclear storm revitalizes Godzilla, who rises to begin his rampage anew. Many would agree it's a memorable scene, but why? As always, we need to go a bit deeper. So to start with, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you this, the visuals in this scene are stunning. You have a massive saurian monster collapsed in the heart of a modern metropolis, a hovering craft that looks like something out of a space opera, a night sky that turns bright red, and a crowd of onlookers here to witness everything that unfolds. Those alone make for an impressive image even without context, and the special effects are about as good as they can be. Remember, this was the early 1980s. Heavy use of CGI in cinema still wasn't even really a thing in the West, let alone in the East. Everything you see here is either practical, done with traditional camera tricks, or features traditional animation techniques, and it still looks great even today. The greater context, however, elevates this scene to something extra special. I've spoken about the Return of Godzilla before, and I always bring up that it's an apocalyptic movie. That apocalypse is framed as one realized by nuclear war, but biblical imagery is deliberately used when it comes to Godzilla. As I pointed out in other videos, he emerges from an erupting volcano at the beginning and falls into one at the end, and the imagery invokes the popular image of hell. The music also has a certain tone to it that straddles the bombastic with the unsettling, resulting in a gothic atmosphere. Godzilla is even referred to in terms that frame him as more than a mere animal. Professor Minami states that being irradiated has made Godzilla immortal, which makes him an impossibility. Being immortal, his nature is skewing beyond the natural, and that which is beyond the natural can only be described as supernatural. Now, to be clear, there are scientific explanations for all of these phenomena. The volcanoes look like hell, but they're not literally hell. Godzilla is immortal, but it's because he was irradiated rather than anything to do with the spiritual realm. That being said, though, the scientific explanations do not make the results any less disturbing. It's kind of like the Cthulhu mythos. The revelation that the Great Old Ones are not literal gods but simply godlike aliens doesn't change the fact that they are uncaring monstrosities who could wipe us out with ease and the universe would never miss us. Replacing the supernatural with the scientific only gives us an explanation without altering the outcome. Ergo, this movie depicts Godzilla as having an earthly origin as he pushes the world towards an earthly apocalypse, but the end result is still him being the beast of the apocalypse. Supernatural or scientific, it's bad news either way. This scene we've zeroed in on demonstrates that idea quite well. As said, Godzilla is down, not dead, but surely on his way out as the cadmium does its work on his system. Then the Russian nuke detonates, and we are once again treated to imagery that, while scientifically grounded, is biblical in style. The sky is illuminated in an unnatural color despite it being the dead of night. Everything shuts down, and lightning descends as if hurled by a vengeful god. This time, though, these thunderbolts are not meant to smite the wicked, but rather to revive the fallen dragon so that he may resume his work. This is certainly how it would look to the crowd that's gathered around to witness it all. From their perspective, they've just seen something akin to divine intervention, wherein some unknowable force has demonstrated its power over mankind by rendering our greatest technology useless against a primordial foe. Again, that's not what literally happens, but the end result is the same. It's a blending of material and spiritual elements to form something truly unique. Just for the sake of argument, what if someone said this scene displays a Deus Exmachina? After all, the humans won and then something crazy happens to undo it. Would acknowledging that make it a bad scene? Well, there are two lines of thinking there. The first line of thinking is that the nuke was set up earlier in the movie. We know the Russians want to launch a nuke at Godzilla. They get talked out of it, but circumstances result in a missile firing anyway. We also know that America is involved in paying attention, so as the only people capable of doing something about that nuke, they take action. What we have here is not a Deus Exmachina, something that comes out of nowhere to force the story towards a specific outcome. It's actually a Chekhov's gun, something set up earlier that plays a role later. Then again, if it is a Deus Ex Machina, doesn't that actually kind of fit in a way? The term Deus Ex Machina originates from the Greco-Roman tradition of storytelling. In these stories, if the hero was facing a particular fate from which there was no escape, the gods would step in and redirect things so that fate is avoided. Or sometimes they might step in to make sure the protagonist meets a fate he otherwise might have dodged. A culture that believes in gods as an everyday fact of life wouldn't think much of this. Of course the gods are interfering. Why wouldn't they? But on the other hand, a culture that does not believe in gods, or else thinks that gods interact with the world differently, well, they would think that a Deus Ex Machina is a cop-out and thus a sign of bad writing. The storyteller wrote himself into a corner, and he can only get out of it by removing agency from the characters and letting a greater force solve the problem. Maybe that greater force is the storyteller exerting his own will onto the world he made. It has since come to represent any instance where an external event disrupts the protagonist's ability to affect the story. Then again, let's look at this scene as if it is an example of Deus Ex Machina. I've already explained why I don't think it is, but let's just play along for a moment. Remember, the imagery here is biblical, and even if the source is worldly, the end result is still the same. As such, we get an external interference at a point where the plot seems settled, and this disrupts the ending we seem to be building toward and asserts a new one in its place. Although explainable in scientific terms, it all appears supernatural. Ergo, if this is a Deus Ex Machina, it's a classical iteration as seen through the movie's established paradigm. Besides that, I've already shown that this development doesn't come out of the blue, or red as the case may be, so I don't think this is bad writing. It's entirely in line with the rest of the movie. So after all of that, is it any wonder that I think The Return of Godzilla is a standout entry in the series? This scene is just one of many great scenes it has, but this is where many threads weave together, and it exemplifies how the movie mixes real-world horror with religious horror to make something that hasn't really been duplicated anywhere else in the series. As such, it's one monstrous moment like no other. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni viewer signing off. And of course, be sure to check out the rest of the playlist for other One Monstrous moments from all over the internet. Be sure to really savor these ones, because we might not be doing this for another few years.